WhiskyCast. Proudly brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Join the Stillhouse at singlepotstill.com and receive an exclusive whiskey tasting journal.
Welcome to another episode of WhiskyCast HD. I'm Mark Gillespie. This time around, I'm in Bardstown, Kentucky, the bourbon capital of the world. Before Prohibition, there were generations of families that made whiskey around Bardstown in central Kentucky. Prohibition changed all that, and not every family went back to the whiskey-making business when it ended. Today, the current generations of some of those families are trying to bring that heritage back.
You'll find is a little bit smoother.
About 20 miles east of Bardstown, just outside Lebanon, Steve Beam and his brother Paul own Limestone Branch Distillery. Their last name ought to be a giveaway.
Jacob had 3 grandsons that followed him in the distilling business, and that was David, Jack, and Joseph. And David and Jack started their own distilleries eventually, and that was, David was Jim Beam's father, so of course that line became Jim Beam. Jack, his distillery was Early Times, and so Brown-Forman now owns Early Time. And Joseph, as far as we can see, stayed at the original farm and distillery, and that's where my great-grandfather grew up. And he worked briefly for his Uncle Jack at Early Times, and then purchased the distillery from the Pottingers again, and that's where he kept the brand T.J. Pottinger, and that's where we get that brand T.J. Pottinger. But his main brand was Old Trump, and he had Old Trump up until Prohibition. He passed away the year after Prohibition ended, so never was able to open another distillery.
But this branch of the Beam family tree also links to the Pottingers, another family with deep roots in Kentucky distilling.
Colonel Sam came into Kentucky, and he followed Daniel Boone and settled in a place called Pottinger Station. And in that group of 25 people who came in, it was interesting because the Dant family and Basil Hayden were in that group, so that was two significant distillers.
Like his ancestors, Steve Beam makes sugar shine in a pot still, but Limestone Branch is also laying down bourbon for the future with some creative engineering his ancestors would be proud of.
This is a steam-jacketed container that we use for cooking our mash. We're able to pump steam through here. It's very efficient, and heat the mash up. We bring it up to temperature, keep it there, and then when we want to bring it back down in temperature, we can change from steam to cooling water, so we can drop the temperature down relatively quickly so that we can add our malt and then pitch the yeast, bring it to pitching temperature. Then we go over and we're using the same tank for fermentation tanks. They're 550-gallon tanks. We do generally about a 450-gallon mash. So this is a 3-day fermentation over here. Then it comes pumped back over here. We make a few minor adaptations, close it up, and this has a copper pipe here that acts as our still. We come across the gooseneck. There is another condensing coil in this water tank, so the steam comes up, condenses through the coil, and we collect our low wine right down here. The coil then is actually preheating the water for the next batch when we cook, so we get a lot of energy savings there. We take the low wine, and then it goes actually through the pot still. So all of our whiskeys are double distilled.
And the pot still is a link to the family's distilling traditions as well.
It is a very basic pot still. The only modern conveniences it has are it's heated by steam rather than direct flame, and we have a few safety devices. Other than that, it'd be very similar to the still my great-grandfather and grandfather would have learned on.
On the hill overlooking Bardstown, the Willett family is back in the distilling business as well. The Willett Distillery is a lot larger scale than Limestone Branch, but with a similar set of deep roots.
There was Willett's in many different locales distilling. They're definitely not spring chickens to the distillation game. I think there was Willett's when you start branching off the family tree. doing cognacs and armagnacs in France, Irish whiskey in Ireland, Scotch whiskey in Scotland, malt whiskey in the UK. So yeah, closer to home, they started this distillery in 1935 is when they broke ground. And
The distillery shut down around 30 years ago, and while the family business survived by selling whiskey from other distilleries, the desire to make their own whiskey never really went away. It took 7 years of construction, but in 2012, the Willett Distillery went back into production.
There was no deadline, there was no rush to get it done, and we built it out of pocket. So it was funded by our existing business, and we didn't borrow any money from anybody or any banks. So essentially, it was built on no budget and no deadline, and that's why it took so long.
They're filling 20 barrels a day with White Dog Spirit, and no pressure to rush it to the market.
When it's ready, we don't have a deadline for that either, but we're watching as it matures and trying to figure out the life form that it's taking. So we hope and expect that in a couple more years that it'll be ready.
Eventually, the Willett Spirit may replace some of the whiskey used for Noah's Mill, Rowan's Creek, Johnny Drum, and the family's flagship Willett Bourbon, but that decision is still years away. For more cask-strength conversation on whiskeys, with the people who make them and the people who drink them, join us each week for WhiskyCast. In Bardstown, Kentucky, I'm Mark Gillespie.